2004, in response to the American invasion of Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zakari establishes al-Qaeda in Iraq, calling for all holy Muslim warriors to resist the foreign invaders. The impact is immediate, as veteran al-Qaeda operatives begin to train raw recruits from all across the world who flood into Iraq and Afghanistan via neighboring nations. The U.S. responds with a massive manhunt for al-Zakari and his senior lieutenants, eliminating a number of them over the coming months. June 7, 2006, closely monitored by U.S. Special Forces acting on intelligence tips from Jordanian and Iraqi sources, al-Zakari is observed entering a remote farmhouse for a meeting with several of his lieutenants. Seconds later, two 500-pound bombs smash into the building. Zakari is observed crawling out of the wreckage, severely wounded. U.S. troops arrive in time to load Zakari onto a stretcher and provide first aid, but he dies an hour later from injuries. The strike slows al-Qaeda down briefly, and 4 months later on October 15th, the Islamic State in Iraq is established. Many al-Qaeda fighters join under the banner of ISI. Early the next year, a massive surge in U.S. combat troops leads to some of the largest post-invasion battles of the campaign, and ISI suffers severe setbacks. 1 year later, ISI has lost nearly 75% of its members, and the flow of foreign fighters into Iraq at last slows to a trickle. On the ropes in 2009, ISI receives an unexpected boost when Iraq's prime minister begins to target Sunni leadership in an attempt to consolidate political power. Many Sunnis react by allying themselves with various factions opposing Maliki's government, with ISI taking the forefront in the fight against Maliki and his American allies. Seizing the initiative, ISI launches a deadly suicide bombing campaign across Iraq, repeatedly targeting Baghdad markets and killing hundreds. The attacks net ISI many fresh recruits, eager to overthrow a prime minister now seen as a Saddam in the making. The U.S. continues a global offensive against al-Qaeda, crippling its ability to conduct terror operations in Iraq and Southeast Asia. Many warn, however, that al-Qaeda is simply being absorbed into ISI, and that the U.S.'s vengeful focus on the terror group responsible for the 9/11 attacks makes for good headlines, but is ignoring the rising threat of other terror groups, such as ISI. In April of 2010, a refocused U.S. military conducts a joint raid with Iraqi security forces to arrest or eliminate Abu Omar al-Qurashi al-Baghdadi, the current leader of ISI. Friendly forces surround a safe house and storm the complex, killing al-Baghdadi, his son, and ISI Minister of War Abu Ayyub al-Masri. The arrest of 16 fighters and the seizure of a treasure trove of documents and computers is an intelligence goldmine for the U.S. and Iraqi forces. Shortly after the raid, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is named successor and assumes command of ISI. With the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011, Baghdadi senses a golden opportunity and dispatches operatives to Syria in order to raise and train an army with the purpose of overthrowing the Syrian regime and claiming the country as an independent Islamic State. The al-Nusra Front is established and begins its campaign against both government forces and pro-democracy rebels. The U.S. responds to the Syrian civil war with support for the pro-democracy rebels. However, intelligence operatives warn that it's very difficult to ascertain which anti-government rebel groups are friendly to the U.S. and which are friendly to Baghdadi's Nusra Front. In a rush to equip the fledgling rebel movement, many U.S. arms accidentally end up in the hands of ISI operatives. July 2012 marks a year of reinvigorated ISI campaigns in Iraq. With the Syrian civil war acting as a magnet for foreign fighters, many are recruited and redirected into Iraq. ISI begins a year-long campaign of freeing former al-Qaeda fighters now imprisoned across the country. The campaign culminates with a raid on the infamous Abu Ghraib prison and the freeing of 500 al-Qaeda fighters, swelling ISI's ranks. Simultaneously, Baghdadi moves from Iraq to Syria, announcing the former merger of the Nusra Front and Islamic State in Iraq into the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. A small number of die-hard al-Qaeda loyalists break off from the fledgling ISIS, but ISIS becomes powerful enough to open up several new fronts in the Syrian civil war. In Iraq, ISIS's Breaking the Walls campaign to free former al-Qaeda fighters culminates with attacks on Shia communities in a bid to further drive sectarian violence and keep the government and U.S. forces off balance. ISIS fighters now begin a campaign of terror against members of Iraqi security forces, targeting their homes and families, driving many to abandon their posts. ISIS firmly controls several northern and eastern provinces of Iraq and wide swaths of Syrian territory as well. In December of 2013, ISIS takes Fallujah, the site of two of the U.S.'s largest battles against al-Qaeda and its supporters in 2003 and 2004. 1 month later, ISIS brings in the new year by successfully fighting off Syrian forces and seizing Raqqa, proclaiming it the capital of ISIS's new emirate. ISIS now controls vast swaths of eastern Syria as well as north and east Iraq. A few weeks later, al-Qaeda remnants officially break ties with ISIS. Seeing their two separate goals as irreconcilable, ISIS wishes to establish a fundamental Islamic Caliphate, while al-Qaeda is still driven to attack the US and its allies. ISIS offensives in Iraq finally see the group take Mosul, giving them control over virtually all of northern Iraq and securing vital supply lines. ISIS fighters take Baghda prison, just northwest of Mosul, and kill nearly 700 Shia prisoners. 2 days after ISIS's victory in Mosul, Iran's security forces are deployed into Iraq to assist Iraqi forces in their campaign against ISIS. Despite being publicly at odds with each other, back-channel attempts are made for cooperation between Iran and the US on tackling ISIS, but the efforts lead nowhere. Iranian forces aid Iraqi forces in the recapture of Tikrit, further empowering Iran's influence over Iraq. In late June of 2014, ISIS secures Syria's Deir ez-Zor province, giving them free rein to extend badly needed supply lines through Syria and into ISIS territory in Iraq. 8 days later, ISIS rebrands itself as the Islamic State and declares the establishment of a fundamentalist caliphate extending from Syria into Iraq. Under pressure from the Iraqi government for a month, the US begins airstrikes against ISIS on August 7th. Without follow-on ground forces, however, the airstrikes are largely unsuccessful at slowing down ISIS's rapid spread. By the end of August, ISIS now controls the entire Syrian province of Raqqa. The US responds a month later by extending airstrikes into Syria, warning Syrian government forces not to interfere with US air operations. The presence of Russian forces backing the Syrian government complicates the US air war against ISIS. In November, ISIS leaders meet with rival jihadist group the Jabhat al-Nusra. Despite an attempt to merge the two forces, no such merger occurs. However, closer cooperation between the two groups is established. January 26, 2015, after a 4-month battle, Kurdish forces with the aid of US and coalition air power and special forces drive out ISIS forces from the border town of Kobani. Turkey remains as unhappy with the border town being in control of Kurdish forces as it was with being in control of ISIS. In May, ISIS forces defeat Iraqi security forces in Ramadi, placing them less than 50 miles from Baghdad. The US responds with an increase in airstrikes, but again, without follow-on ground forces, ISIS remains undeterred. Still, the aggressive bombing campaign makes the prospect of pushing to Baghdad an incredibly improbable one for the ISIS fighters. The next month, ISIS splinter groups in Yemen claim responsibility for a series of car bombings in the capital. Sensing an opportunity in Yemen similar to that in Syria, ISIS, however, meets difficulties as both Iran and Saudi Arabia have strong stakes in the country. On that same day as ISIS attacks in the Yemeni capital, Kurdish forces continue their successful campaign to sweep ISIS off the Turkish border, pushing their fighters out of Tal Abyad. 5 days later, they take the military base of Ain Issa. In September, Russia begins an official air campaign against ISIS, but in reality is heavily targeting US-backed rebels. Despite setbacks along the Turkish border, ISIS influence expands into northwestern Syria as the group takes 6 villages near Aleppo. Days later, Iraqi forces successfully recaptured the Baiji oil refinery, a massive source of revenue for ISIS. On October 22nd, a US Special Operations soldier is killed conducting a rescue mission of ISIS hostages in northern Iraq. It's the first US casualty in the fight against ISIS. 20 ISIS fighters are killed in the raid, with 6 more captured. In November, Kurdish forces continue their campaign against ISIS by capturing Sinjar in Iraq. The capture threatens key ISIS supply lines into Syria. With special forces on the ground en masse, the US kills ISIS finance minister Abu Saleh on December 10th in an airstrike. The US campaign against ISIS oil infrastructure is proving devastating for the finances of the group. 3 weeks later, Iraqi forces retake Ramadi with the aid of US air cover. 2016 begins with the progress and a reversal for the anti-ISIS coalition. Iraqi forces capture the town of Hit, destroying any hope for an ISIS assault on Baghdad. However, ISIS recaptures several key points along the Turkish border from the Free Syrian Army. Desperate for oil revenues to fund its war, ISIS successfully takes the share gas fields from the Syrian government. Meanwhile, in Iraq, ISIS forces are on a steady retreat after a string of Iraqi victories. Iraqi forces, with the support of US air power and special forces, retake Rutba and advance toward Fallujah, which has become an ISIS stronghold. Simultaneously, the US aids Kurdish forces in an assault on ISIS holdings in North Syria. The group is caught between 2 pincers and slowly being squeezed to death. In late June, after a fierce battle, Iraq retakes Fallujah. 2 months later, Egypt kills the leader of the Islamic State in the Sinai Peninsula. From Libya to Iraq, ISIS forces are slowly being squeezed to death as the coalition targets their financial sectors and recruitment networks. From 2016 to 2019, ISIS forces in Iraq and Syria are now slowly pushed out of strongholds they have held for years. By spring of 2019, ISIS is no longer considered capable of launching military operations, though many members of the group have gone underground to perpetuate a war of terror across the Middle East. In 2020, ISIS efforts to recruit and train in Africa meet with mixed success, but the group launches a violent offensive of terror across many Western African nations. With fresh recruits and the fallout from a global pandemic, ISIS remains poised for a comeback. Now, watch Is It Safe to Live in Syria? Or click click this other video instead.